What's up, everybody? Tom Pelissero here with the guy who's been living in a cave for 6 months, Judd Zulgad.
Just in Montana, actually. Yes, that's fine. Small shack, actually.
I look in the mirror and I see the mustache. With you, though, the mustache enters a room before you.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happened. As somebody said today, your facial hair grows too quickly. I agreed with that. You know, actually, if I knew how to trim this up, I might keep it, but I just don't. I don't have the energy. I don't even recognize myself right now. Do you recognize me out there? Probably not.
I can't look at you either.
I can't.
I'm going to stare into the lens. We're at Winter Park.
It's like football.
It's Wednesday. One interesting development today, Judd, Percy Harvin saying he, quote, definitely, unquote, will be on the practice field. And he was not on the practice field, which is not entirely surprising when he says that he couldn't walk until yesterday.
Are you convinced, though, Tom, he won't play? See, the one thing with Harvin is I think he won't play, but he's the one guy that doesn't really need to practice, and the threat of actually having him even dressed for the game almost is worth it to me. I wouldn't be dumb with him, but if you use him, let's say you have Jarius Wright active, you have Percy Harvin active, even if you don't use Percy that much, the Bears are going to have to account for Harvin whenever he's on the field, so I'm not definitely willing to declare him out. However, I will say this, that's a pretty serious injury, so it's not going to surprise me if he doesn't play. But if I'm the Vikings, I don't blame them one bit for keeping this as a game-time decision.
No, and it's not entirely surprising either that he's continuing to have issues, even though Leslie Frazier was highly confident that he was going to be able to get through the rehab portion of this and be back out on the football field. I still want to see, does Percy do something tomorrow? Does he do something Friday? If he doesn't practice the entire week, Frazier at least hinted that he won't be available against the Bears just because of the time of the layoff. It's not like you're coming back 1 week later. This is clearly a significant thing. The Vikings haven't been on the practice field at all. We'll see how that plays out throughout the week. And this is a big week, Judd. Going into that game in Chicago, and Leslie Frazier has made no secret about the fact that this one is more important than the others, and rightfully so, just like the Detroit game was, because that was to set up and make these games relevant going forward. Now you've got relevant games. With that comes pressure. With that comes some expectations. You've got everything sitting there in front of you. The next 3 games, I look at it as a 3-game sequence here, at Chicago, at Green Bay, home against Chicago. You got to win one of those, win 2 of those, and you're right in the thick of things. You win even one, you keep yourself alive.
And how funny is this? When we looked at this schedule and in April, or even at the start of this season in September, we looked at this 6-game stretch and said, if the Vikings are going to win any games this season, they need to win them before this 6-game stretch. I don't think anybody could sit here and say that they thought this 6-game stretch would actually be important, because the Vikings were sitting at 6-4, 1 game behind the Packers and the Bears. If they win against the Bears on Sunday, they will tie the Bears for what Chicago be 7-4. They will be 7-4. I don't think any of us expected going into the season that this 6-game period would actually be relevant. And it's great for Frazier and Spielman, too, because if you look at this now, as you just said, the pressure is on. That's ideal. I mean, now you're putting Christian Ponder in a situation where you can see how he performs with pressure on him. I think we all expected this 6-game stretch just to be extremely difficult for a team that might win 4 to 6 games. It is a totally different scenario than any of us expected going into the year.
It certainly makes the evaluations more valuable to you as well, being able to look at these guys in these pressure situations, because let's not forget, the last 2 years, they were playing out the string at this point. And you had a variety of different things going on behind the scenes. You had a coaching change at this point 2 years ago. Last season, they were so deep in a hole at that point. From everything I heard, guys came back from the bye. They weren't putting in the extra time. They weren't doing extra film study. Everyone sort of was on a different level. As much as I remember Kevin Williams telling me out in Carolina, hey, we're 2-6. We can get to 8-8. Let's try to get to 8-8. Guys came back, and they were on another planet. This season, completely different sort of a vibe. You said it's ideal for Spielman and Frazier. In theory, unless things don't go well, in which case this is not ideal for Leslie Frazier.
It's not, Tom, but that's a really good question. Is what does he need to do? What do the Vikings need to do in these last 6 games for him to get a contract extension? Now, in 2005, Mike Tice worked on the last year of his contract, but you do not see that much, if at all, in this league. Leslie Frazier is going to be on year 3 of a 3-year deal next year, so one would think this offseason he either gets fired or gets a contract extension. But, Tom, they're at 6 wins right now. I mean, if they play well in these last 6 games, if they keep them close and they win 2 of them, is that enough? That's the question to me.
I don't think there's any question that's enough.
Because
I think if you are at least if you're in these games, that's the big thing. It's how you get to it. But that was how it always was, going back all the way to the preseason. It was never he's got to get to X number of wins.
Because that wasn't fair.
How do you get there? Does the team develop? And do you make the adjustments within the game? And from week to week, do you get better? We saw some of that against Detroit. I think that was probably the most positive sign was they corrected some of what ails them against Detroit. But this is a different sort of a matchup now against Chicago, too.
And here is the interesting, intriguing thing to me. When we saw this schedule back in April, you look at a schedule and say, okay, based on 2011, here's what we expect. Now you can look at this 6-game stretch and know exactly what you're facing, right?
Sure.
You're facing a Chicago team coming off a bad game against San Francisco, a Chicago team that's won all of its games against teams with either 500 or losing records. So, yes, they've been successful. They've won 7 games, but now we know what Chicago is. Green Bay seems to be improving. St. Louis is, 3-6-1, but not a pushover at home. Houston, by the time you get to that Houston game, how much is Houston going to have to play for? I mean, they're 9-1 right now.
Or even Green Bay in the final week.
Exactly. So this schedule now is shaping up where you only can look at it and say, okay, it's just all tough games, but you know a little bit more about exactly how tough they are. And the remarkable thing to me is we're actually looking at the schedule like that. Like I told you before, I thought we'd be looking at these 6 games just saying, it's tough and the Vikings are going to play out the string. I mean, we're actually talking about a Vikings team, I don't think they'll be in the playoffs, but that could, if they're successful here, make at least a wild card run, which is remarkable to me and which is why Leslie Frazier should keep his job.
I don't find that part of it that remarkable because I thought that if they could get to 4-4 at the midpoint, they ended up being 5-3, but if they could be 4-4, the second half of the season at least would be interesting, and you would have them in some higher pressure situations. Even if they were 4-6 right now, you're at least close enough that in theory you could look at this and say, hey, there might be something to play for here. You at least could convince yourself of that. But 6-4, you're a game back of the division lead right now. If you manage to beat Chicago, as tough as that is, I haven't seen what the line is yet, but you haven't won there in 5 years. It's a Bears team that, granted, got the crap beat out of them in San Francisco. A pretty embarrassing performance, but didn't have their quarterback in that game. Now they're back at home where they play well. The Vikings have not played well there. The Vikings in the last 4 games, since they last won that game in 2007, have allowed more than 40 points a game in the 4 matchups at Soldier Field.
But last year was what? McNabb starting at Soldier Field. It was a complete debacle.
That was the McNabb benching game.
Exactly right. Exactly.
You had other things. You had field position problems. You had Devin Hester with another return touchdown. That's going to be a big thing, too. Can they contain that guy? Because he's given Chris Kluwe, for one thing, a lot of trouble.
And what's the stat we saw all Monday night? Devin Hester, as of late, has not been that great, but Devin Hester has magnificent success against the Vikings. This will be an interesting matchup. But if they split with Chicago, they're going to be in pretty good shape. I'm really surprised that going into this stretch of games, we're talking about a team that could be in the playoffs. But here's the other thing to keep in mind, too. What is the whole philosophy about this league? It's a week-to-week league. I mean, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, we're talking about how they're struggling. They played terrible against Tampa Bay. They struggled against Seattle. And all of a sudden, we're saying, okay, these might be the real Vikings.
But that's what they are.
And, no, I know, but then what happens?
That's going to have ups and downs.
But I'm just saying, they're week to week to week. It's interesting because this discussion changes on a weekly basis based on who the Vikings played last and how well they played. The Musgrave, Ponder, that whole thing on Sunday. I'm very curious to see coming out of the bye how Ponder plays. We're going to get a very good read on Christian Ponder over these next 6 games, I think.
Another big-time thread here is turnovers because you look at the Bears near the top of the league in turnover margin. The Vikings are, I think, 23rd in turnover margin. They don't force a ton of turnovers in almost the same scheme that the Bears play because the Bears have certain individual guys who are able to do that. Look where the Vikings have had trouble. It's when they do cough up the football in the early going, they fall behind. This is still not a team built to come from behind. Get them down 10 points, they're going to be in trouble.
And regardless who plays quarterback, Cutler or Campbell on Sunday, the one thing that I'm interested to see is how this Bears defense comes out. Because they got embarrassed on Monday night, and they weren't missing guys. I mean, this was a defense that's ordinarily very, very, very good and opportunistic, and they played a bad game on Monday. Curious to see how that goes. Also, sounds like Mike Tice wised up this week and said Jamarcus Webb's going to get some help on Jared Allen. I hope he does.
Shock. You don't want to use Matt Forte?
That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen, though, I don't get how you can't give your left tackle some help, and those Bears tackles against the 49ers
or your right tackle, because Gabe Carimi was awful.
But, I mean, they were both just terrible.
He's Judd. I'm Tom. Full Vikings coverage at 1500 ESPN.com. We'll see you.
I might keep it.